There are nearly 1.5 million registered medical devices on the market in Australia. Now, you would think that these life-saving devices, pacemakers, defibrillators, and pain pumps among them, would be subject to the same sorts of clinical trials that drugs here are, right? I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris, and you're listening to the Morning Edition from The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Today, investigative reporter Liam Mannix on which devices Australians have made complaints about the most, and the medical device under investigation by a coroner after a tragic case in a regional town in Victoria. It's July the 20th. Welcome, Liam, back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
Okay, let's start off with the basics. What are medical devices?
Medical devices are devices, technology that we use in all sorts of healthcare applications. So that ranges right from really simple things like surgical masks or tongue depressors up to much more advanced stuff like implantable pacemakers, glucose monitors, insulin pumps. So a really, really broad range of technology. And I think it's important to emphasize the breadth of that technology. There are about 1.4 million registered medical devices in Australia, which to me just seems like a bit of a crazy number, really.
And you have identified a problem with medical devices. So just tell us what that problem is broadly and how did you actually come across it?
Sam, for me, this story starts in 2018. I was reading an American report about spinal cord stimulators. These are implantable devices that go into the spine that promise to treat chronic pain. In America, they have one of the highest rates of reports of adverse events to the regulator. And I thought, isn't that interesting? I wonder if that's true in Australia. Once I started looking into it, I quickly discovered that it's almost impossible to discover that in Australia. So we have a public database of adverse event reports linked to medical devices. You can query an individual medical device, but due to the design of this database, it is impossible to get out aggregate statistics. Now, aggregate statistics is the stuff that we really want to know. How do medical devices compare? Which medical devices are producing the most adverse event reports?
And just to let listeners know, I'll just jump in and say you're speaking about the Therapeutic Good Administration, otherwise known as the TGA, its database, isn't it?
Yeah, that's correct. The TGA's database, known as the Database of Adverse Event Notifications. What we ended up having to do, Sam, was put in a Freedom of Information application to get back the data on spinal cord stimulators. This is supposed to be public data, but this database essentially makes it almost inaccessible. I had long looked at that story and gone, well, the TGA had this data. They just weren't taking action on it until I started writing about it. What else might be on this database? We cracked open this database and downloaded about 81,000 adverse event reports, and then we started wading through them, working out which devices were associated with the most reports and which devices had interesting patterns of reports that we could try and drill down into. At the same time, we interviewed about 70 people inside and outside the TGA, doctors, scientists, patients, to really build a picture of how the regulations governing medical devices work and how effective the regulator is at keeping unsafe medical devices out of Australia.
And it's really quite an incredible story here. Even the backstory is incredible because before recording, you told me that, as you just mentioned, this database is meant to be public, but it's inaccessible. It's ultimately, you can't get the information from it because of the way it's designed. So you actually had to use AI to create code, which would enable you to scrape this database to get the aggregate information that you wanted. So just tell us, like, what did you actually discover? What devices were causing the most problems?
So we were able to build a series of web scrapers through a bit of my coding and a bit of AI coding that was able to go into this database and over the course of several months, individually get out all of these adverse event reports from each registered medical device in Australia. One of the most striking findings was the devices that seem to be causing the most adverse event reports at the moment, and they're diabetes devices. So that's continuous glucose monitors and automated insulin pumps. And that really surprised me. We know a lot of people use these devices, but when you speak to scientists and doctors, they say they're terrifically safe, they're highly effective. So then it became a real question. What's going on here? What might be driving these high numbers of adverse event reports?
And I do want to ask just straight off, I mean, how many Australians have diabetes? Because as a layperson, I think this is a common condition. So a lot of people could be potentially at risk here if their devices are faulty, right?
You're absolutely right, Sam. About 1.3 million Australians live with diabetes. In recent years, the federal government has started to subsidise a lot of these devices, particularly continuous glucose monitors, for some people with diabetes. So they've been rolled out really widely. But along with that rollout, we're also starting to see a significant uptick in problems, in people saying, I've had a significant problem with this device.
Okay, so tell us, what are the major issues with the diabetes management devices?
We spoke to a range of patients who said to us, we are having accuracy issues with these devices. Continuous glucose monitors are meant to be able to give you an estimate of what your blood glucose is so you can make treatment decisions, injecting insulin or not. But we spoke to a range of patients who said, I got a reading from my continuous glucose monitor and then I double-checked it with a finger prick test and my reading was way off. And when that happens, that really worries people with diabetes because getting the treatment decisions wrong can lead to really, really nasty outcomes. And that seems to be backed up by the adverse event data that we have, where there are so many complaints about inaccuracy, and in some cases, people who have been injured by making treatment decisions based on those inaccurate readings. And when we looked further into this sector, we noted that there have been a number of recalls and product alerts and regulatory concerns about the accuracy of these devices. And I want to call out one really interesting specific issue, Sam, which is the case of William Swale. So the coroner's court at the moment is investigating multiple fatalities linked to a car accident in Daylesford.
It's a lazy afternoon in a busy beer garden. Families enjoying themselves, oblivious to the horror that's about to strike.
Breaking news in Victoria, where 5 people have been confirmed dead after a car crashed into a beer garden just after 6 p.m. in Daylesford at the foothills of the Great Dividing Range.
Witnesses say a BMW launched itself towards the pub's courtyard. It's a grassy area with a few picnic tables, nothing dividing patrons and the road.
It's one of the most confronting scenes, I've been told, that experienced officers have been to.
And the court has heard evidence that the driver at the time, William Swale, who was a type 1 diabetic, was driving while his continuous glucose monitor was connected to his smartphone, which in turn was connected via Bluetooth to his car. These continuous glucose monitors are meant to give you audible alerts when your blood glucose is getting low. But Swale said his did not, apparently because once the phone was connected to the car Bluetooth, it automatically muted the alarms. In 2025, US medical regulators warned that connecting a phone linked to a continuous glucose monitor to a car Bluetooth system can mute blood sugar alarms. But our investigation discovered that the TGA never passed on that warning, despite receiving a number of adverse event reports about people who had issues with Bluetooth connections and continuous glucose monitors. The TGA told us it publishes device-specific or general safety information about medical devices on its website where appropriate. This is informed by safety signals and any trends, including numbers of adverse event reports received from both overseas and the Australian market.
And Liam, just to play devil's advocate for a moment, when it comes to the glucose monitors, you said you've spoken to some scientists who say there's really robust clinical evidence these devices are safe. So could it be that the amount of complaints that you're seeing about these, or that the TGA is receiving, that it's just part of this margin of error for any device or for any, mechanized item on the market, that it is generally safe and sometimes in rare cases, these things aren't safe?
That seems plausible, Sam, and it's important to emphasize that a range of scientists we spoke to and doctors said that these devices were robust, reliable and accurate, and there is high quality clinical evidence showing that. But I don't think we should dismiss the patient experience. It wasn't hard for us to find many people who said they had serious and, in their description, life-threatening issues with these devices.
After the break.
At the moment, I think it's left to patients to try and work out the safety and efficacy of their medical devices, and I don't think that's good enough.
And you have found problems with the system more broadly, though, right? Aside from this very tragic incident of this man with type 1 diabetes.
That's exactly right, Sam. Listeners will remember the pelvic mesh scandal from several years ago, where a number of Australian women were injured, ended up with chronic pain due to a medical device. And we wanted to ask, have the regulatory loopholes that were identified in that case been fixed? And we don't think they have. The Therapeutic Goods Administration states that all medical devices approved in Australia need clinical evidence showing that they are safe and perform as expected. But that clinical evidence doesn't look like what you and I might think of. Many medical devices are approved without randomized controlled clinical trials, the type that you'd expect to see for drugs. Some are approved on the basis of equivalence, which is this idea that your medical device looks similar to another company's medical device, and therefore you can rely on their clinical data to show that your device is safe. And in Australia, about 85% of our medical devices are approved based on European certification, which introduces an additional problem. Unlike Australia, in Europe, medical devices can be approved by notified bodies, which are private for-profit corporations typically paid by the manufacturer of the medical device to audit and approve the device. And that, many experts tell us, introduces an almost unmanageable conflict of interest right at the heart of the safety of medical devices.
Okay, but that seems wild to me, though, that a device either might be implanted in your body or perhaps one that you rely on to prevent serious medical issues was not subjected to a big clinical trial. I mean, you mentioned just there that you would expect them to be like clinical trials are, of course, used before drugs are approved. And you mentioned, of course, the lawsuits with the mesh, and those were transvaginal mesh that was implanted in women, I believe, to treat urinary incontinence and other issues. Isn't it a bit shocking that those aren't subjected to a clinical trial?
I find it absolutely shocking, Sam, and I suspect many of your listeners would as well. Spinal cord stimulators had this very problem. Because there were no high-quality clinical trials, we ended up with a raft of devices approved and being widely used without, experts told me, high-quality evidence showing that they were effective and safe. As part of our series, we've picked up another device that's often used for chronic back pain, a pain pump. And once again, this device was approved many years ago based on European certification, and despite being approved for years and in use in many patients, we still lack high-quality evidence showing it's safe and works. The problem, Sam, is once a company has a device approved, they in fact have a disincentive to run a high-quality clinical trial because it might show the device doesn't work terribly well. It's almost better not to know.
So tell us, though, what have these companies and the TGA, what have they said in response?
Well, the TGA says that all medical devices supplied in Australia must and do have clinical evidence sufficient to demonstrate an appropriate level of safety and performance when used for their intended purpose. Medtronic, the manufacturer of the Synchromed 2 pain pump we spoke about, said the system was registered in line with legal requirements and the device has more than 2 decades of established clinical evidence and is used by physicians globally. The manufacturers of continuous glucose monitors told us that it was likely that their devices had high numbers of adverse events because they were very widely used. They said that there was high-quality clinical evidence showing the devices were safe and effective, reduced complications, and improved blood glucose control.
So, what then needs to change? Like, what are the first things that need to happen?
To my mind, Sam, the low-hanging fruit here is allowing external researchers to participate in the surveillance process. There are lots of researchers around who are highly skilled at looking at medical data and spotting problems. I think the TGA could do more to pair with them, open up its data and say, here's what we're hearing, can you help us spot the problems as they emerge?
But is there not a problem even earlier on in the process in terms of things that are being approved here without having a clinical trial? That seems to be a problem, no?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Sam. I think the standards that we set for medical devices could be much higher. We could demand high-quality clinical trials before devices are approved and licensed for use. We could demand that devices actually be formally tested by the TGA. We could say that it's not good enough for many devices to be approved without any auditing or testing at all. At the moment, I think it's left to patients to try and work out the safety and efficacy of their medical devices, and I don't think that's good enough.
And then, Liam, just to wrap up, I imagine a lot of listeners would be hearing this and thinking what I'm thinking, which is that if they're about to be fitted for a medical device, or if they've got a loved one who perhaps is about to be, what questions can they ask their medical health providers that might help them ensure as best that they can that the device that they're being recommended to use is actually safe and it hasn't been, say, flagged as having problems in another country?
I think you should always be willing to ask your doctor, what are the risks and what are the benefits of this device, and what's the quality of the evidence like? How do we really know that the benefits of this device for me outweigh the risks?
But does someone's general practitioner, are they likely to be across what sort of complaints have been flagged about devices overseas? Like, is that something we can reasonably expect of our GPs or other health providers?
I think any health professional who recommends a medical device should be able to explain to you the benefits and the risks. But you hit an important point, Sam. Many doctors simply trust that the TGA wouldn't approve a device without high-quality evidence showing it works. But unfortunately, that is simply not always the case.
So, Liam, obviously the listeners don't have the benefit of your skills at their fingertips in their own private households. But what will you be doing in future? You know, what databases or what sort of private research will you be doing to ensure something is safe? Do you have any tips for the listeners?
While people should always be guided by their health professionals, I think it is reasonable to hop on the internet and sort of look for any potential red flags related to their device. Recalls, safety alerts, adverse events, because the TGA does make this data public and you can check it and then bring it to your doctor and say, look, I've read about this. What does it mean and how worried about it should I be?
That is very helpful. Thank you so much, Liam, as always, for your time.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for having me.
And just a note on a couple of things raised in this episode. Firstly, in the case of the Daylesford crash, the driver, William Swale, was initially charged over the deaths. A magistrate struck out those charges in 2024, saying a reasonable jury could not convict Swale of the criminal offences. And secondly, in response to this series, the TGA said all medical devices included in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods must meet regulatory requirements for safety and performance. This is demonstrated through appropriate evidence. Regardless of pathway, no device is approved for supply in Australia unless it meets these requirements. Today's episode was produced by Josh Towers. Our executive producer is Tammy Mills, and our podcasts are overseen by Lisa Muxworthy and Tom McKendrick. If you like our show, follow The Morning Edition and leave a review for us on Apple or Spotify. Thanks for listening.